enthusiasm and joy, happiness, let's say, is 100% dependent, as far as we can tell, on observations that you're progressing towards a valued goal. It's not attainment focused, that's satiation. You get something you want and you're satisfied about it. That's a whole different neurochemical system. But enthusiasm and joy that people associate with happiness manifests itself when you're moving towards a valued goal. So if you don't prioritize your goals because you don't exist within a structure of value, then you have no positive emotion. And positive emotion is half of forward-moving motivation. Well, in fact, in terms of forward movement, it's almost all the motivation, because the embodied manifestation of positive emotion is the movement towards a valued goal. That's what it is. That's why you have the positive emotion, because you are a creature that can move towards goals. And the emotional signaling of that is positive emotion. No goal, no positive emotion. No hierarchy of goals, dilution or eradication of positive emotion. Because if you're confused enough and you have 100 goals and you can't prioritize them, then every goal has 1% of the significance necessary to really move you forward. And so to be maximally motivated, you need to know why you're doing what you're doing, all the way up Jacob's ladder, all the way up. And that brings us to the notion of the macrocosm that's the heavenly hierarchy. And in some sense, it's a psychological macrocosm, although not in all senses, because it brings society into the purview. So here's a proposition. Any system of priorities is a structure of values. So you may or may not accept the proposition that you have to hierarchically arrange your perceptions. You also, by the way, have to do the same thing on the action front. Because if you're inclined to do 10 things at once, you can do none. And consciousness, by the way, is a very narrow channel. And we generally can only concentrate on one thing at a time. And the reason for that, in some sense, is because we can only act out one thing at a time. And so not only do you have to prioritize your perceptions, which are action-based anyways, you also have to prioritize what you're going to do. Because you have to do the first thing first, and then the second thing, and the third thing. And that's obviously a structure of priority. And a structure of priority is a structure of comparative value. And a hierarchical structure of comparative value is an ethic. And so what that means, as far as I can tell, and this is something, if it's true, is that we cannot see the world except through an ethic. And I mean that literally as well as metaphorically. You literally cannot see the world or act in it. You cannot perceive the world except through a structure, a hierarchical structure of value, which is an ethic. And so then I would say, and here's something else to chew on for like 20 years. A story is a verbal description of a hierarchy of perceptual and action prioritization. And the reason that we're so attracted to stories is because it's so difficult to perceive and act in the world that we're hungry at the level of soul for a narrative that represents to us a hierarchical ethos that we could embody as a model for emulation. And so that's what our stories are. They're models, they're ritual models for emulation, most fundamentally. And the anti-hero story, well, that's easy enough to contend with. It's like, watch this person who ends up in catastrophe and hell and do the opposite of whatever it is they're doing. And so that's a powerful lesson, because there's something very compelling, as we said before, about very powerful negative emotion. And so even if you don't believe in heaven, you might be able to conjure up a belief in hell. And if you can't, I would say, well, you're either not using your imagination, or you're hiding, or so far you're just lucky. But I wouldn't expect that to last. One question might be, well, what do you mean to be a good person? And of course, that's the problem of the logos. And the answer to that would be something like, well, I want to be the proper mediator between possibility and actuality, such that the best possible actuality can be manifested by the possibility that I confront. And every bloody thing you do, everything you see, is either nested in a unified hierarchy like that, or it's not. So let's say, what happens if it's not? Well, we actually know what happens if it's not. And let's say you're not unified psychologically in your value orientation. Okay, what's the consequence? Well, entropy. That's the first consequence. It's like, are you doing one thing, which you know what you're doing and can commit yourself to and can actually undertake, or are you so confused that you need to do 15 things at the same time, and you don't know which of them is most important? And the importance, by the way, is diluted by the multiplicity, right? Because if you pick something out as singularly important, you actually elevate it as important. If 15 things all of a sudden become equally important, they're all 1/15th as important, because if they weren't, you wouldn't have a problem sequencing them, and that means they're not motivating. So one of the consequences of that is that there's no positive emotion. And so you can certainly see the catastrophe and even the hellish catastrophe beckoning. And you might think plotting a route that would make that the least likely seems to be a good idea. And so part of the reason that we're fascinated by villains and supervillains, for that example, or part of the reason we're fascinated and endlessly so with figures like Lucifer and Satan is because we're attempting to flesh out the nature of the antithesis to the worst kind of hierarchy of values. And that's gripping to us. It's gripping to us. Now, there's more to it as well, because we also will turn our attention to the negative to fortify ourselves against the negative in preparation for confrontation with the negative. And so we can do that through use of fiction. And that's what we're doing, for example, at least in part, when we do such strange things as amuse ourselves with horror films. And so any system of priorities is a structure of values. That's an ethic. It's hierarchical because one thing has to be put before many things, and things have to be done in sequence, and everything has to proceed in some sense in an intelligible manner towards the highest possible goal. And the alternative to that is not only the radical unhappiness that I already described, which is the destruction of any possibility of enthusiastic engagement with life in a meaningful sense on the positive front, but the other price you pay for being confused about your ethic is anxiety. Most particularly anxiety, because anxiety is actually a signal of entropy in perception and action. If you don't know what you're doing, you don't know where you are, and you don't know where you're going. And if you're in a place where you don't know where you are or where you're going, you're in danger. Because that's unmapped territory, and God only knows what lurks in unmapped territory. And you can think about that biologically. If you're somewhere you don't understand and you don't know where you're going, well, there's always the possibility of predation. But you can think about it metaphysically too, and that's worthwhile. If you're so confused and disoriented that you don't know where you are or where you're going, there are predators of the spirit who are much worse than snakes that are waiting in wait for you. And the probability that you'll move from aimless, hopeless, joyless anxiety to nihilism, corrosive bitterness, and genocidal fantasy in the fundamental extreme is very high. And so that's possession by a predator of the spirit in the desert of the soul. And that's real. So a system of priorities is a structure of values, an ethic. A narrative, and that would include a drama, is the description of a structure of values or an ethic or a set of priorities. We see and act out the world through what, when described, is a narrative. Now that's interesting. If that's true, it's very interesting. It's interesting partly because, the postmodernists, who I don't admire, generally speaking, they figured this out. They figured out that we likely see the world through a story. And that might even be true for scientists, is that a scientist, and Carl Jung believed this too, by the way, is that science takes place within a surrounding narrative. Now, what the postmodernists did, the French postmodernists in particular, and then the Americans through Yale most particularly, they leapt from problem, which was how do we perceive, solution, we see the world through a narrative, to narrow solution, which is that we prioritize our perceptions and our actions by imposing a narrative of power and dominance. And they swiped that from the Marxists. And that is simply not true. There is no evidence for that. Animals don't even do that in their social communities, or when they do it, they erect unstable and extremely violent social hierarchies. There's no evidence whatsoever that hierarchies predicated on a narrative of power function productively even for the people that impose the narrative of power.